Snow on the sidewalks here in Toronto, a major bridge dispute at the border, and U.S. aircraft carriers moving closer to the Middle East. And later in the brief, I'll tell you what to watch for next in the U.S.-Iran talks, and why the next 10 days are now the key window. In Toronto today, it's snow, and it stays cold. Expect a high near 1 degree Celsius. Across southern Ontario, the wider pattern this weekend has been messy. Some places getting rain first, then a change back towards snow or flurries. And that's kept roads uneven from one area to the next. If you're driving between regions, assume conditions change faster than the forecast text suggests. And a quick local note on culture. Lunar New Year celebrations are continuing in the city, with weekend events running at Toronto's Dragon City Mall, part of the Year of the Horse festivities happening across the region. Turning to sports, 2 injury storylines that could shape the next few games for Toronto hockey fans. At a Leafs practice, forward Matthew Knies had a scary moment that had coaches and medical staff visibly concerned. The team hasn't framed it as a long-term situation yet, but it's the kind of practice incident that can change a lineup quickly. And then there's Austin Matthews, also tied into the U.S. national team picture, where there was significant medical news just hours before a gold medal game. The main point here isn't the drama, it's the timing. When decisions land that late, it can affect minutes, matchups, and how aggressively a player is used. Okay, those are the familiar quick things close to home. Now the stakes shift outward. The main thread today is a U.S. military buildup near Iran, happening in parallel with indirect talks over Iran's nuclear program. What's happening? The U.S. has moved dozens of aircraft and major naval assets into and around the Middle East. Open-source tracking, flight data, maritime signals, and satellite imagery has been used to map it in near real time. 2 U.S. carrier strike groups are now either in the region or moving toward it. One carrier, the USS Abraham Lincoln, is operating in the Arabian Sea near Oman, with escort ships alongside. Public satellite imagery has placed it there. Separately, the USS Gerald R. Ford, reported to be heading toward the eastern Mediterranean, was seen in verified images transiting near the Strait of Gibraltar, and it briefly appeared on ship tracking data after activating its transponder. Here's the key point. This isn't just diplomatic pressure. It's a visible posture shift that reduces the time between a political decision and potential military action. Why it matters now? President Donald Trump has put a clock on it. He said strikes could begin within 10 days if there isn't a deal, and he's signaled the U.S. may have to take it a step further if the talks fail. The talks themselves are indirect, taking place in Switzerland, meaning messages are being relayed rather than negotiated face-to-face. That matters because indirect formats can keep lines open, but they can also slow clarification when there are sticking points, especially on verification and timelines. The risk here is misreading, on either side. When major forces are already in motion, routine military movements can be interpreted as pre-positioning for an imminent strike. And as that interpretation spreads, it narrows political room to pause. What could plausibly happen next? There are 3 tracks to watch, and they can move at different speeds. First, the diplomacy track. Whether the indirect talks produce even a short-term framework that both sides can describe as progress. Second, the military track. Whether those carrier groups and the supporting ships remain on station, increase their presence in specific choke points like the Strait of Hormuz, or begin operating in patterns that suggest contingency planning. Third, the messaging track. What Washington and Tehran say publicly over the next week. When leaders attach timelines, the language becomes part of the leverage. It can also become a constraint. A quick Canadian angle, because it connects to the broader theme of security and cross-border friction. A new Nanos poll suggests 55% of Canadians now describe the United States as the greatest threat to Canada's security. Polls don't predict policy by themselves, but they do shape the political room leaders have when dealing with Washington, especially on trade and defense. And on trade infrastructure, the Gordie Howe International Bridge, Canada-funded 6 lanes, expected to open soon, has become a fresh pressure point. President Trump has threatened to block its opening unless the U.S. is fully compensated. And U.S. Democrats are now probing Trump's ties to the owner of the competing Ambassador Bridge. For Canada, the practical question is simple. Does a major trade corridor become a bargaining chip? And there's another trade signal from the U.S. this week. After a Supreme Court rebuff on tariff authority, the Trump administration says it will shift to a different legal tool and set a temporary worldwide tariff at 15%, with goods compliant with CUSMA described as exempt. The details and timelines matter here, because temporary authorities can still create real uncertainty for exporters while the clock runs. Now, back to the main thread, because this is where the next update is most likely. The final piece to watch is whether the US and Iran can use the next several days to define what a deal would actually mean in practice, especially on inspection, enrichment limits, and enforcement. If the public timeline stays at within 10 days, then each day without a clear sign of progress increases pressure on both sides to show they're not blinking. So here's your orientation heading into the week. Watch for any statement that sounds smaller than a full agreement, an interim step, a pause, a verification mechanism, because that's the kind of outcome that can extend talks without either side declaring defeat. And watch the carrier movements, because they're the clearest, least rhetorical signal. That's the brief for Sunday, February 22nd.